When did you arrive in Iraq?
It was we flew out of Bliss July 4th of 2004, so we got there the next day or so, I suppose, and we arrived in Kuwait, of course, first for some follow-on training before we moved north.
And you were with the Illinois National Guard, is that right?
Yes,
And it was you volunteered to go to Iraq.
yes.
Why? Why did you volunteer to go to Iraq?
Well, it wasn't just me, but the other 10 folks on my team volunteered. The situation in Illinois is that we've had this partnership for peace with Poland for a number of years since the early 90s, as they transitioned out of the fall of the USSR and the Eastern European countries, tried to establish their independence and looking around for those that might support them in some way. Of course, the U.S. has interest in Eastern Europe for a long time, and interesting, each state in the United States has a partnership with a country, not necessarily Eastern Europe. But Illinois, with the Illinois National Guard, partnered with Poland. And I had gone to Poland, and they had had soldiers come to us in the early 90s. And so we had established a relationship. And one of the reasons Poland was the partnership for Illinois, because Chicago has the largest number of Polish folks outside of Warsaw. No other city other than Warsaw has more. And so it was a natural connection with the history of those two. And the bottom line was after 9/11, we had troops when they first went into Iraq. They obviously supplemented active duty with National Guard Reserve, and the Polish, who were there early in large numbers to support the operation, the coalition forces, um, wanted to have their partners from Illinois that they had worked with at the highest levels. And so Illinois had sent a team of 6 or 8 or 10 right away. And every year they rotated them. So they would reach out. It wasn't a unit, it was a group of officers with different backgrounds that would assist and be liaisons with the Polish division headquarters. And so there's an opportunity for folks to volunteer to have their name on the list, no guarantee, but you wouldn't get selected if you didn't volunteer. And so that was my opening, if you will, to serve in that capacity.
And now, I mean, you're married. You have, is it two children or three at the time?
Three
Three.
at the time, yes.
Yeah, three children. This is a year-long tour. You'll have some, you'll have a break and be able to come home briefly. But it's a pretty significant sacrifice for everyone. Um, so what was it for you as you're, thinking about whether or not you should volunteer for this? What is it that tipped the scales toward saying, yeah, okay, I'm going to go to Iraq and do this for a year?
Well, at this time in my life, in '04, I had been in the National Guard for 15 years. That included initial active duty for training, where my wife moved to a military base with our oldest son, who was our only child at the time. And then as the other two came along, we continued with annual training, additional training. So it wasn't a year long, but for 15 years, my wife had been very independent and supportive. So I knew that was going on. But you're right, a year is a long time. When I joined the military, I remember thinking, how in the world do those Vietnam veterans leave their families for an entire year? I just couldn't comprehend that. It was just hard to wrap my mind around that concept. And like you said, here I was raising my hand, as so many others had, whether they raised their hand for a deployment or whether they raised their hand when they first enlisted and knew that they could go any place at any time. But my logic was that I was 39. I'd been in 15 years. I'd seen others around me deploy. I just hadn't been in a unit that deployed, a good, bad, or indifferent. And I knew that I may not have too many other opportunities. I'd hope so. I hope that we would wrap the conflict up and we wouldn't have our folks in harm's way. But it was a window of opportunity to do what I trained for my entire military career. And on the civilian side, I'd been a state trooper for nearly 15 years. And I remember 9/11, and I remember the actions that we took in this country to protect and harden our potential targets. And I wanted to do something more than just say, I served, and especially when others were in harm's way. But it was a trade-off because my kids were 12, 14, and 16, which are tough ages. And again, not only would my wife be here, but she would become a single parent for that year. And there's no guarantees that I would come back.
Where was Iraq at this time? And as I look back on it, that initial push, um, it seems like Gulf War 2.0. Man, this is going to be easy. The statue of Saddam goes down in Baghdad. We're seeing video of Iraqis, celebrating the Americans rolling into Baghdad and other places. The president lands on the aircraft carrier with the big mission accomplished sign behind him. Seems like Gulf War 2.0. And then the IEDs start going off and things turn sour, and there aren't a whole lot of folks, now who look back on the Iraq conflict and feel very good about it. Where were things at that time in your own in as you were looking at the situation in Iraq at that time as you're making the decision? What did Iraq look like to you at that point?
Yeah, so we were very interested in that question because we would soon be there once we knew we were selected, and we had a few months before our rotation would occur. And so we had communication with the team that was on the ground because, that's firsthand knowledge and insight. Not that they were going to send us any top secret information, but certainly the operational tempo and things of that nature as it applied to our mission. And it was interesting because it evolved from the initial establish, destroy those that are firing on American forces to get established to more of a stable, secure and stabilized mission where you're going to secure the communities, you're going to secure the roadways, you're going to stabilize the communities, you're going to eventually get to the national elections, which happened in '05.
Yeah,
And so what we envisioned that we're just going to assist and be a liaison to the division staff. And as they do operational planning and as they accept the missions from the Corps headquarters and they have their area of responsibility, and we would do our piece of the puzzle. Each of us 11 had a specialty, if you will, in which we worked with our counterparts in those sections at the division headquarters. And then we work down with the next lower level and some capacities for training and things of that nature and oversight. So the bottom line is when we arrived there, just to give you a context, my counterpart was getting ready to leave, and so we'd go up to Baghdad, Abu Ghraib, which recently before our arrival had the big reserve unit issues with the photographs and the incidents that transpired there that certainly harmed our image worldwide and our military and so there's a lot of attention on that, if you would. But I remember we would drive up there, and even after they left, our mode of operation was a Chevy SUV, no armor, just a civilian vehicle. And one of the videos I have is a short clip of going up the main supply route Tampa North, and I had the CD player playing. It was like that's what they trained us. You go up there, you might have some supply trucks and trucks of other things, but you're civilian, you're comfortable. And after a few bullet holes, some came back, shot up a little bit, and some of our other international partners were wounded or killed. It was like, wow, maybe we should park the SUVs and get more vehicles. So we started with the Humvees, and of course, they had fiberglass tops and some canvas, and probably SUVs were more secure. And so that started that whole transition where we had, I think it was a National Guard unit. I read about another unit that the mechanics just started welding metal plates on the side of their Humvees because of, as you mentioned, the IEDs that started to evolve and become more commonplace and were so devastating. And so it had evolved as you posted to more from this and there were still efforts, for schools and clean water and all those operations were going on, but there was also continued military and maybe ramped up because the threat, if you will, was increasingly dangerous through '04 and '05.
you used the phrase, we're going to go there and help secure and stabilize. Just to jump ahead into 2005 after a year, at the end of that year, did you feel that Iraq could be secured, that Iraq could be stabilized?
Well, I was doubtful, and in reflecting back on the Vietnam experience and what I knew about that these troops would go for a year, but they wouldn't go for a year and declare victory and pack up and go or have a force there to stabilize like we did with World War II in Japan and Germany. And I say that because it was like when we were done, we were just happy we made it, right? And the next group was let's hope it's safe for them and they all get back. But it was just almost this concept that it's more of the same. And there was ongoing training with the Iraqi police, for example, and Iraqi military and trying to get them stabilized. And that was ongoing.
Yeah.
But the definition of victory or success or the end state was, I will say, very murky from my perspective, looking back. Like, how do we know when we're at the finish line? Is it because we had the national election? Well, we had that. Everybody said it went great. It wasn't all the violence they thought it would be. There was some, but is that now we're successful? We can, not that we were all going to leave, but do we have to not worry about IEDs anymore, or being attacked by snipers or mortar rounds? That wasn't the case at all. And I believe it was a small percentage of the population, and I believe that's very common, but a small percentage, whether it's criminals in the United States, or whether violent criminals, or whether it's a threat in the Middle East that wants to stop you, or at least send a message, can be significant. So yes, my perspective evolved from before. We need to get rid of the terrorists. We need to finish the job there so they don't come to the homeland. We
Yeah.
need to make it safe for our families back home. This is a sacrifice. To We see this almost like this hamster wheel where it's more of the same. Just rotate the troops back, stabilize, secure, facilitate, train, and didn't really see what the end state would be.
Wow. You just used the phrase terrorists, and one of the things I've picked up from Iraq vets is that after a while they realized that they really didn't know who the enemy was. Um, on Tuesday, the people who are trying to blow us up, shoot us, they are committed, radical Islamic terrorists. The next day, it's a gang. The next day, it's criminals. Like we don't even know who the enemy is. I've heard this from Iraq vets. From day to day, we weren't even sure who was shooting at us and who we were shooting at. Does that resonate at all with your experience? Just like a lack of clarity about who the enemy really even is on a given day?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I wasn't an infantry officer. I wasn't a special force. I wasn't a sniper. I wasn't going kicking doors down, going building to building, and with a target, a list. I was more in a support role, although exposed to threats time and time again. But even from my perspective, and I'd been on many convoys, exposed many times, and seen the results of the enemy, right? However, the enemy is defined, if you will, and been to too many memorial services there and even back here. But certainly that's an issue. And I go back and look at Vietnam, and I thought, how in the world could they have operated where they don't know if the villagers are friend or foe? At one point, you're providing a building, providing medical care, and the next thing there's an explosion or attack in Vietnam, and likewise to some degree in my experience in Iraq, that we're just going about our business one day, and all of a sudden we've had this nice Alaska barrier circle around our base with 30-foot walls, and all of a sudden mortars start landing because they can go over the top of walls. And that was certainly not a friend or a friendly fire, right? And those types of incidents that have occurred. And then you go on your convoy and you see the folks to the right and left in the communities and the highways, and you wonder, I wonder if they are responsible for firing those mortars last night. Who would know, right? Obviously, we have intelligence. We have operators that go out there and try and identify the threat and find out the source of the attacks and
Yeah.
take the ID. But yeah, that was a big issue because when it comes to the rules of engagement, that was another category that what's the right rules, right? I mean, you wait until your friend gets shot and killed, and then it's like, not that that happened personally to me, but then you can fire back, or is there more of a proactive stance where you just restrict space, and anybody that enters that space is deemed to be a threat, right? So it became quite a challenge, my perspective of being there.
Yeah. So I want to ask, obviously we need to ask you about, what your basic job was, and we'll do that. But before I ask that question, I'm interested in the question, what did the war mean to you when you first set foot in Iraq? So, you've come in from Kuwait. You first set foot in Iraq. At that moment, suppose the soldier next to you says, what is this war about? What would you say? And then fast forward a year, now you've just lifted your foot for the last time off Iraq soil as you've got on the plane to leave or to get on, whatever the transportation mode is to get out of Iraq. So what did the war mean to you when you arrived? What did the war mean to you when you left?
Yeah, so I'll say personally, I still remember getting off the aircraft in Balad. and it was just almost surreal. It was super hot. We're on the tarmac. We had just did the C-130 landing to avoid, fire on the aircraft, the circle to it. It was like very surreal because we were there. No matter what happened the next moment, we were there. We were automatically at risk. And what would the next year hold? But in the same tone, was so happy to be there that we saw their service personnel and we saw the military buildup, and we were a part of something bigger than ourselves, something that those that had gone before us had done time and time again. And so there was this combination of emotions like we're here, we need to focus on the mission. We've got a long time we're going to be here. We want to make a difference, and we want to make a difference not only there, but for our nation back home to make it safer for them. And so it was a very positive, although we don't know what we don't know in terms of how it might play out. And then if we fast forward to the end of the deployment the year later, I think I left with a sense of if I had to do it all over again, every day, every action, not that there's not room for improvement, but everywhere from volunteering to going on the missions that maybe weren't required, but they needed assistance with, I would do it again. On the larger scale, I'll say, if you look beyond the individual effort and the individual perspective of doing your part, I was optimistic on the front end that the nation will look better for what for our presence when the mission is complete than it did when we arrived. Not just the year, but I mean the entire U.S. presence and
Sure.
coalition force presence. And looking back on it, today, and again, I don't study it regularly and find out, how their economy's doing or how their, public safety is right now, but I'm very doubtful that it's the thriving democracy that maybe our nation had a vision of. I mean, we're certainly not setting up tourist trips there and highlighting the progress and the success and the stability and security of that country even today. So in that regard, it's disappointing that, so much blood and treasure was shed for something that hindsight 2020 we wonder in some respects, was it worth it, or was there other pathways that could have been taken to accomplish a mission if this was the outcome that was less costly, especially to our troops and their families physically and mentally.
Yeah. What was your basic job? I know day to day you're probably doing a lot of different things, but what's your basic job for that year?
Yeah, well, within our team of 11, we sort of have a team obligation or responsibility. And mine was essentially the S1, which would be the staff officer for personnel. So we talk about things like orders and reporting and things of that nature. And also we had 11, and our lead officer was an '06, a colonel. And so me and him worked in close proximity, if you will, to make sure that all the administrative tasks were taken care of. So that was my daily job, but almost as encompassing my liaison job was with the provost marshal's office for the Polish division, and in that capacity, responsible for training and tracking and facilitating operations related to detainee operations for the entire division. And really, that area of operation included not just the international forces, but we had Marines there. There were special forces there that within that AOR, although they didn't report directly to the Polish general, they were in that area. And so I would get reports from all these entities and refer to detainees detained, transported, released, and those were sent up to the Corps headquarters to my higher headquarters. So a lot of responsibility, and that also evolved into assisting with personal convoys up to Baghdad and back on a number of throughout that year.
Sure. Um, so you mentioned that you're with Polish forces, and one of the things that's really striking to me about your year is, you talk to vets and they'll say, well, we had brief interactions with Brits or with Australians or something like that. But it seems that your year, you were regularly in contact with non-American forces, and I mean, I think you even mentioned a small number of troops from El Salvador. Is that right? Is it?
Yes, yes,
Oh,
absolutely. We even had Mongolia. We had I think 21 countries when we arrived.
yeah.
Spain had just left. They were one of the larger contingents. And within our physical base in which our division headquarters was at and our other support units there, I think we had 12 specific countries represented. And our daily briefings were typically the colonel in support of logistics for the division would do the briefing to the commanding general, two-star general, and then there would be a Ukrainian general, and of course the Polish generals. And so at that level, daily briefings were all international forces that were had their representative. If nothing else, like from Bulgaria, the colonel from Bulgaria would give an update on the status of their forces because you'd always have, and most of the countries had 6 month rotations, and so you'd always have some country that's getting ready to transition from the current staff to the incoming staff. So there's this all sense of ev evolution, I guess, with the staff and with the different country contingencies.
Yeah, so mostly you mentioned Polish forces and then Ukrainian forces. Um, I didn't know, or maybe I knew at one point and forgot that El Salvador had a small number of troops there. I believe you mentioned Norwegian troops, is that right?
Yes, Denmark and yeah, some from the
Danish troops,
yeah,
yeah.
Northern Europe.
Mongolian, you said you just mentioned Bulgaria,
Yes.
which I didn't know. Bulgaria was there. I mean, small numbers, but. Um, Now, I suppose each country is, going to have different motivations. Why did their government, come on board? Because, of course, before the invasion, it was a very controversial thing. What was your sense? I guess, since it seems like you're spending most of your time with Poles and Ukrainians,
Yes.
what was your sense of why they were there? And I wouldn't expect that you would have the inside scoop. So I'm just really mainly just whatever you might have picked up. In your assessment, were the Poles and the Ukrainians, were they there because their governments really believed in this mission in Iraq, or were they there because they saw this as an opportunity to show solidarity with the United States and to build some capital with the United States, for their own self-interest as countries that, only recently had come out from behind the Iron Curtain?
Yeah, I'd say both can be true, especially in the soldiers' perspective, those that were to my right and left, and mostly officers. They had very few, if any, NCOs and almost no enlisted. Um, they had them, but not at the division headquarters. They had groups at bases surrounding us. But my daily interaction was with the officer corps for the most part. I mean, we'd have those that were driving in convoys and enlisted that had the duties to perform missions, civil affairs and things of that nature. But the officers that I worked with were very happy to be there. It was there some financial advantage to them personally. I mean, they were working full time in the military. Whether they would work back home or not, there was some personal, and there was personal pride with the history of their nations and their history of their militaries. This is just one more sort of I won't say notch, but one more example of them stepping up to a threat of what many saw as the threat to many nations, not just in the U.S. but also in Europe and beyond. So there was that. But I believe that the leadership of those nations, this is my belief, no one told me this, that they saw there was some political gain and potentially financial gain. And the United States certainly more is better. If you want to say that we have a coalition, it's just not a U.S. operation. Countries from around the world, well, the more flags you have there, at a glance for the photo op, it's like, wow, this is not just the US and a couple other countries. This is everybody. Even if everybody includes, to be transparent, I was surprised that some of these countries had 20 people, maybe 30 people. Their contingent was very specific, very narrow. Their mission very narrow. Their restrictions on what they could and could not do were very tightly held. While others, the larger contingents, I'll say, like Poland, they were doing operational missions. They had sustained casualties, and that's the risk. Every time you leave the quote wire and you're on some mission outside, you're at risk. And I think what happens, and perhaps with Spain, and I don't know because they had left as we arrived, they had a large contingent. But I think as casualties start to mount, the sentiment back home and the political pressure was like, well, what are we doing there? How long are we going to be there? How do we know if we win? Some of those same questions that some, I think, in the States started to ask
Mm.
about the purpose and the longevity of our involvement in the mission. So it was interesting because it was like I was in a cultural experiment almost by just meeting and greeting and connecting with and understanding and talking with these folks from different parts of the world.
Sure. What kinds of challenges did you face? And there's one example that comes up in what you've written. I believe you're speaking with a Ukrainian officer and talking about, treatment of detainees, and that in addition to being, fed and housed in a basic way, they need air conditioning and things like that. And if I remember right, the Ukrainian officer, said, you know, basically, why are we treating these people so well? They're the enemy. And, your response was, well, we've got rules that we need to adhere to. So I guess, my first question is, did I get that story right? And, what kinds of challenges did you face when you're working with soldiers, military forces from very different cultures?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I wouldn't say that what I observed was any mistreatment at all. It's
Mm.
sort of like if a university or an organization would get an audit, right? And they would say, well, you're doing 18 things right, but these last two, they're not critical, but it could be a slippery slope and we need to abide by the standard. And if it's another finding, then it could be a problem. And so, as you pointed out, food, water, shelter, those types of things were provided. And there were some things that on the checklist, as I essentially were going from to detainee facility, that where detainees would be held before they were transported after a review of the circumstances, a local review up to Baghdad, or perhaps in some cases they'd be released if the evidence didn't reveal that they were the ones that committed whatever was alleged, for example. But yeah, I would say that my experience was the Ukrainian officers sort of had that mindset that, why should we go above and beyond or even check every, dot every I and cross every T, because they just tried to kill one of our own, right? And we can understand that logic, but the reverse logic is that, as you pointed out, as I mentioned, there are standards to follow, and just because somebody else doesn't follow, we're essentially, in my mind, would always underpromise and overdeliver on the care of detainees. And to the degree that for those that were released, maybe there was a confusion, maybe that wasn't in one example, there was a photo camera, and the thought was they were taking pictures of the military base. Well, it turned out that we developed the film and it was opposite direction, right? So they may have had nefarious reasons, but nonetheless, their evidence showed that they weren't photographing the base, so they're released. And the thought was, how much good do you do when those folks go back to their communities and are like, wow, how did you survive in captivity with the coalition forces? In fact, you got the Quran, you got food, you got shelter, you got protection from mortar attacks, you got treated well. So it's that whole concept that we have to err on the side of what we say we're going to do, which is treat everybody humanely and give them all the resources as we would want if the roles were reversed. There were some challenges. Some were language, some were cultural, some were the military agreements. And I remember in one case, I'll just elaborate briefly, where we needed Polish and Ukrainians to come from their other posts, other locations for training for detainee operations. Specifically, at that point, we're trying to identify those detained because we couldn't use fingerprints in many cases with biometric, eye uh, photos for lack of a more descriptive, and they couldn't leave because they said they didn't have enough people. Well, they had the same number of people the last time they'd left for a mission, and it went all the way up to Corps headquarters, and the bottom line was that training was delayed but completed later. So there were some challenges in terms of command structure and in communication and culture. But that being said, I was really impressed for the most part with how all the nations responded as far as the missions. I think at higher echelons of, general officers contacting their, leaders back in their host in their nation, maybe they got some different direction on how far they could go with certain missions in terms of exposing their soldiers because casualties have an effect on the population back home and usually not a positive one when it comes to the leaders that have agreed to send them into quote harm's way.
If I remember right, you went on 140 convoys.
Yeah, yes, all in total, yes.
So of those 140, I wonder if there are two or three that you could speak about, the two or three that most stick in your memory.
Yeah, and I'd say that most, in my experience, and probably with many, I would suspect, even transportation companies that were out daily, most go typical is again, it gets kind of back to the analogy of a police officer. Most days on the job are routine and almost boring. But then you have those occasions that happen that are sort of branded in your memory for life. And one that is very impactful was actually on February 28th of 2005, about 1600 hours. We were half an hour south of Baghdad. We had brought some people and vehicles up to Baghdad, got that mission done, and we're headed south on main supply route Tampa, which was the common quote interstate route with checkpoints and all the way up and down. And at that point, three vehicle convoy, and we had IED detonate in the front where our lead vehicle ended up on upside down, and so we worked through that, but that was the most impactful. The second one that I recall was a convoy to outskirts of Baghdad, and we were there on a mission to deliver handguns and thousands of rounds of ammunition to a Iraqi police training site, headquarters, whatever it was. Never been there before, but we were up there, I think, with just two Humvees, which was kind of small. We had the machine gun mounted on top, but it wasn't the open interstate what you envision. You actually got on the outskirts where you had the multi-level buildings and folks milling about. And we had arrived, we thought we did, and there was a wall along it, and it was just on the other side. We had a translator, which I can't say enough about the value of translators and how they probably saved our lives time and time again. But in that condition, where you have these people, really, you just get that feeling, right? You're kind of undermanned, undergunned, and you don't know what's going to happen. That second story window, where the people are milling about, and vehicles are within. But the bottom line is, we stopped for directions, or he got out and spoke fluid local language as well as Polish and English and Spanish. And we found out the location was the other side of the wall, so found the right entrance, and that was fun. And so that was a great mission, other than that risk. Except for we found out the next day that all those weapons that we had brought to Iraqi police training center were gone with the police trainers, just disappeared. And so you reflect on that and thought we put ourselves in harm's way. And the third one was coming back to the base, and there was a little misunderstanding, I'll say. We're lined up to show our IDs to get into the gate where it's safe, and all of a sudden we're stopped. We're there for a long time. I think we were coming back from a election warehouse right before the national elections, and I was in a gunner's turret, which usually I'm not. Usually a driver or co-driver, sometimes most often a convoy commander. But I was up there for whatever reason we had rotated, and so I could see and hear, and there was this yelling and screaming up front, which is not typical. We were a couple different convoys just backed up from the gate. And all of a sudden, somebody's talking about, well, there's an IED out here. We've got orders not to let anybody enter. And then people get more excited. Well, we're going to just stay here. There's a IED out here. And so it sort of evolved, and there was sort of almost a standoff of blue on blue. It was really uncomfortable, I'll say, looking behind our convoy and seeing all these other civilian vehicles sort of maneuvering. Bottom line was one of the vehicles just went around and went through the gate, disregarded the gate. So there was a little bit of a flare up, I guess, of different countries that were sort of engaged in that verbal conflict. And so there was some follow up on who said what and how. Ends up, hours before we got there, the EOD folks had been there and determined that it was like a spent canister from a rocket that somebody had seen that was no threat at all. But again, that communication and then the communication to those at the gate really makes you think that, wow, it's surprising we didn't have more miscommunications that may evolved into some friendly fire, if you will, inadvertent or otherwise. So those three, I say, stand out the most that we experienced.
So I want to ask you a couple questions about, what you just walked us through. You mentioned Iraqi police officers that the coalition forces or the United States provided a lot of weapons to them, to the police. And, this, I'm assuming this gets back to secure and stabilize. So we're trying to build up a police force. Um, and it sounds like that, walk us through this, that the weapons that were provided to these police to do their work as agents of security and stabilization in Iraq, those weapons actually disappeared and probably ended up on the black market in the hands of um, terrorists and others. Is that what happened?
That's my belief, and I wasn't privy to any additional follow-up intelligence on an
Yeah.
investigation on what transpired after that. But just based on my experience, that we brought them, and what we know is that they were gone, and not like they were distributed other police throughout the country, but they were like gone, and so were those that received them. So, in a manner that was not expected. It wasn't part of the plan. Apparently, again, our mission was very, very narrow. But just the feeling that, being a police officer for 15 years, and knowing that the trust and respect that we have in our police, but also knowing that a small percentage, whatever small that is, is subject to corruption. And then I think later, well, who's to say that somebody didn't have whoever the commander of that training center's family and threaten, you turn them over, they're dead. I mean, I never heard anything about that, but I'm just saying that that's the level that could have transpired. I'm trying to think of all the possibilities, and as we were reported that they're gone. Sorry, you really did that for nothing, and hopefully they don't end up in, but probably will, the black market, or threatening coalition forces with those weapons we provided them. Sure, that's not the only time that's happened, and certainly we know of events where there was even training environments where U.S. and coalition forces were present, and then quote friendly local turns the gun on friendly forces intentionally, or detonates an IED. We've seen, unfortunately, that happen time and time again. But yeah, it just really takes you down a notch that we did this with this in mind, to secure, to stabilize, to train up the police so the community will respect them and they can enforce the laws and make it safe. And here they themselves are to the level of corruption where they blatantly, they know they would be found out, but for whatever reason that probably wasn't a random act either. It was probably planned. When we deliver them, they had a plan what they were going to do with them. And so yes, very disappointing and discouraging, I'll say.
Did that lead to thoughts in your mind or in the minds of others who said something, well, if these folks don't seem to care about the health of their country, meaning, kind of the level to which we can trust each other and have security, stability, a culture of trust. If they don't seem to be invested in that, then why should we be invested in that?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple thoughts on that. One is, I'd like to think that that's the isolated exception to the rule, that you have 90 other police training sites where that didn't or wouldn't happen, and you have this one corrupt one, which in the world we live in, it seems like there's always a percentage. But on the larger possibility is maybe that was typical, and we didn't know what we didn't know and what was going on behind. Maybe it is very possible that it wasn't guns that were sold on the black market, but maybe information that put us at just as much risk, or more, from those that were friendly with us on the surface, but yet we'd find an IED down the road the next day.
The first incident you mentioned where there's an ID, the Humvee's hit, the Humvee's flipped over. I wonder if we could kind of walk through that, kind of step by step, maybe starting with, a minute before the ID goes off, and then what was the aftermath? Was there a firefight? Did a medevac helo have to be called in? How did that story unfold?
Yeah, so I was the middle Humvee, so the Humvee was in front of me that was damaged, and we had our interval so that if something would happen by design, we had given a convoy briefing the night before and what our role was, the expectations, as we always did, the emergency procedures, as we always did. So here we are, 7 months into the deployment. I think we had two Danish soldiers with us. Maybe we oftentimes had a advisor, Army National Guard from Alaska. He would volunteer to help us when we need staffing to fill up the Humvees, to have enough staffing. So anyway, I think he was behind me, and the translator for the team was, I believe, with me. Nonetheless, all of a sudden, first time we have this explosion in front of the convoy, and the Humvee in front of me, where one of their team members is driving, another one's in the turret, um, reacts to it. Again, this is an up armored Humvee at this stage of our time, where they've got them swapped out, which is good. And so I think as a natural reaction, he swerves hard left because you have this explosion. I'm an artillery officer, so I've seen artillery rounds and not that close, but I've seen the detonations and the sounds and the effects in training. And again, it was out of nowhere from whatever conversation we were having to there it is. And I believe there's no shrapnel in the Humvee, which was great. Um, but when they turned sharp left, as you can imagine, going down an interstate and just sharp left out of instinct, that with all that weight, once it started rolling, that's what rolled upside down. And our buddy in the turret dropped down as it was rolling. Fortunately, was still injured, but certainly wouldn't have survived. And I remember as the moment it happened, and I'm seeing like one of the wheels upside down spinning, and just in that second of trying to, because we all stopped immediately, and thinking, and as a state trooper, I've seen so many fatal crashes on the interstate and other roadways, and that is not a survivable crash. Only one vehicle, but it's upside down. Somebody was in a turret, others inside, and just in an instant, everyone exited, went to pull out our friends and colleagues, and I got on the radio to call for help. I didn't know what was going to happen next. It was that calmness, that quietness as that tire spinning. And I know that if it's an ambush, oftentimes with just three Humvees, one that's out of service and its machine gun upside down smashed, that this is the window of opportunity. Fortunately, no engagement at a greater distance. We saw folks milling about, but I knew we needed to get some support, so I did that, and then I helped get some ammunition and things as the injured were being helped out, and I asked if we needed a medevac. I could see the one appeared to be injured, and the answer was yes. So I called the medevac in, and they responded very quickly and medevaced one of our friends up to Baghdad. The other one actually went to the next morning, but I think it was the adrenaline and everything, and no physical appearance of injury. So we had two that were wounded, and we shortly after that had a convoy show up of Marines, which was encouraging. And so we didn't think anything was going to happen after that, and we had the EOD show up to get the leftover EOD components that they would take to analyze and to ensure there's nothing further ahead that we could continue on. And so we got back to the base late that night. And obviously, a very emotional, not knowing about our friend to what extent there might be internal injuries, and the interesting thing that I was thought was so important, we had a convoy briefing because the next morning, a few hours later, we had another convoy scheduled to go to Baghdad right by that same spot. And to me, it was a show of resilience, even if no one else known, that they're not gonna stop us individually or as a nation or as a coalition.
Often, you mention in your memoir that you're doing things in relation to Abu Ghraib and moving detainees around. Now, are you in the presence of the detainees that are being moved around? Do you have regular, at least close, in terms of proximity, close contact with these detainees?
Well, overall, the responsibility was to ensure that the hundreds of detainees, which ended up being, I think, thousands over the course of the year, that their information was captured in a secure means, transmitted to the corps headquarters in Baghdad, so that even if I had no contact, even if it was in our area of responsibility as a division, that had to be done for accountability and what the status was and as it changed. So that was a primary, but certainly within our operating area, within the units that were at our division headquarters or nearby, we often would have detainees that were at the local brigade detention facilities, we'll say, which were sometimes not more than a concrete building that was a temporary holding place. And we would be responsible to ensure that they got transported. Now, if there was a shortage of personnel or they needed supplemental vehicles for the convoy, so they're not a target, especially after Abu Ghraib, because I think it became known that some of these convoys going in and out of Abu Ghraib and north and south were had detainees in the back of the trucks, and so sort of a target. And so we want to make sure there's plenty of quote gun trucks or firepower if need be. And so I went on a number of those. One of the transitions from the first team that we replaced to ours was that have you had a chance to go to Abu Ghraib? Because not just going from A to B, but the process there with the paperwork, the documentation, the transfer, the accountability piece was really important, and they wanted to have an officer there, particularly if possible, a U.S. officer, especially after Abu Ghraib, to make sure. And so sometimes not just myself, but another team member would go, who we would have regular hearings. He's a JAG officer, Judge Advocate General, so he had the legal side, and I had the basically the policing side and to organize. And so the answer to your question is yes. There's numerous ones where we would have numerous detainees, and interestingly, not only that, but sometimes they would have detainees that would come back. And then, well, why would they come back? Well, the example I gave earlier with the photograph, and if they found out the evidence at that level of the investigation revealed that they were not a threat or there's not enough evidence to show that whatever transpired, they would be released, which means we would take them back to their community, whatever that is, and turn them over to the Iraqi police where they would assimilate them back in the community. And I often thought that sometimes they didn't seem too eager to go back. And of course, they had all their health and food and everything else and security, and nobody, I guess, impressing upon them or threatening them from a community. Often wondered what the community thought about that. Like, why did they release you? What did you say or do, right? And to get you to get your release. And I assume many would say, well, I didn't do anything wrong, and they agreed with me. But nonetheless, those were some of the more memorable ones, especially some of the individuals that, as we prepared to go or as we um, prepared to release, just to hear words out of their mouth sometimes. And most of them wouldn't say anything, but every once in a while some did.
Well, yeah, and so you've kind of answered this question already, but maybe you can add a little bit. I just, as you think of the detainees, and given your experience, I'm sure you can bring a lot to your mind's eye. Um, do any stick out in your mind for any particular reason? Of the many detainees that you had interaction with, brief or otherwise, do any of them, particularly stick out in your memory?
Well, I kind of compare that to civilian policing, where you're taking somebody to the jail or there's a warrant for their arrest, and you almost shake your head thinking, "I can't believe that this person committed this type of crime." Your prejudgment, I guess, whether it's being prejudiced or being just based on your lived experience, like somebody that commits this crime doesn't typically, isn't like a grandmother, for example. And although that didn't happen a lot, there were cases in that. And so that mindset makes me always open to, anybody could do anything. You can't judge somebody just because of their age or gender or their conversation skills. And one example, I think it was Danish soldiers that were there with the Polish soldiers and sort of getting them ready to transport and up north. And there's a conversation that I didn't ask, but I heard. And I guess, they all have all these packets for each detainee. It has all the information about where they're detained and why and all the information. And one detainee officer must have had the insight to realize that this person was accused of murder. And in fact, not just murder, but allegedly, I think it was killed an Iraqi police officer in the form and fashion that obviously is more than just a kill. That there was a beheading as the means, and the gentleman was not your typical detainee. He had a suit on and well shaven beard and didn't look like if you wanted to say this is on the list of terrorists and or somebody that could perform that type of act. And so they ask him, and did you do this? Of course, I expected him to say, even if he did, what would he say? Why would you even ask him? Of course, he's going to say no. He doesn't want to get caught. And he had very fluent English. And they tell me that his background was as a professor at the university. And it kind of reminded me because when we were delivering the weapons to the Iraqi police, I remember and took a picture of the sign in that community where I think it said that Department of Agriculture, University of Baghdad, or something along those lines. And I'm thinking, he was at a university, educated, informed, and he very straightforwardly said, "Yes, I did it, and I'll do it again if I have the opportunity." Essentially, and I thought, wow, kind of a scary thing that, as you mentioned earlier, like who is friend and who is foe, and how would you know? So I had an opportunity of the 11 of us on our team that it was Christmas was coming up had an opportunity to request leave. Well, we had some that had went earlier for whatever reason in that year. And there's no guarantee, but typically you get a week, 10 days or so off during your year, go back home and then come back. And some of our team just couldn't fathom coming back home and then having to go back, and they wanted to wait till almost the end, or not have that many more months to go. And so hey, I had an opportunity too, and my other buddies said, hey, there's 3 spots, we all want to go. Great news. Sent a message home to my wife, hey, I'd be home for Christmas. Who would have thought, right? And so it's not like the whole unit, like you think military units would get an aircraft and they go from point A to point B. Pretty much you just go to the air base and you just sign up. It's almost like as available. And so we did that down at Tillil Air Force Base south of us, and we had to wait and finally got a flight because it wasn't just flight from their home, but you had to go down to Kuwait, and then from Kuwait we get a commercial flight back. And so the I'll say the flight from Tallil to Kuwait was a HR flight, which I really didn't think about at the time. I always thought HR in the world I lived in civilian was human relations HR, right? And this was human remains flight, and they said it's an HR flight. We're like, we'll take the next flight, and then we realized as we boarded that there was a carry team. I think it was Air Force, and they had a flag covered casket that they were boarding on the aircraft we were on, which adds a whole dimension. Not that we didn't know that there were casualties with the time we were there, but it's a little more personal when you're on an aircraft, a C-130, whatever it was, and here comes a flag covered casket positioned with the escort that would accompany the body. And whatever time the flight was from there to Kuwait, you have some time to think with the humming of the engines, like, but for fate, it could be any of us in that casket. And we're going home to Christmas to see our family and get reacquainted and a happy time. And yet there's a family back in the States that has been notified already, probably got the knock on the door that their daughter, she'd be coming home for Christmas, but not to celebrate. And a time they will forever impact them on that time of the year, I'm sure. And so I really felt, emotionally torn about that experience. But I think when I finally got home, all the more appreciative of family at home because I realized so personally that not everybody had that opportunity, and going back, not knowing that if I wouldn't be back with my family, I didn't know what the next few months, what fate would hold for me. But it was really, very, a very emotional experience.
My understanding is that as the casket came onto the plane and then as the casket was taken off the plane, that you and I think it might have been one other officer, you stood at attention or even saluted.
Yeah, you wonder, obviously out of respect, and it wasn't like it was a large formation and some,
Yeah.
official event, but it was just something we could do that was meaningful, we thought, for that event and for that opportunity to show our respects, and certainly there was no other alternative than to stand and salute.